Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn to control the hidden elements and properties of every HTML block. Hope you'll join. Hey there everyone. Today we're going to touch on a topic we've actually briefly touched on before. What is it exactly? Well, the CSS box model. Today we're going to be revising three main parts from that concept that will allow us to control those hidden properties that are a part of every HTML element. Those three items for today will be the margin, padding, and border of every HTML element. Hope you'll stick along. Before jumping straight into things, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys an overview of the setup we'll be working with today, which will primarily consist of a little bit of code and CodePen. Just a single div with the class of blocky, which will allow us to add a width of 100 pixels and a height of 50, while we also make the background color red. I'll explain the body later, but before we jump in, know that we're going to be looking at three primary things for each of these properties today. We're going to be looking at what it is, how we use it, and some tips and tricks on how to best use it. So let's jump in. So to begin with things, we're actually going to touch on the margin. Now, what is the margin? Imagine we draw a box and that box contains what we want. In order to create a margin, what we do is push or create a force field outside of that area. So with a margin, you can kind of think of it as your house being part of the main block, having its border and the padding within, but our margin would be our yard or wherever the fence lays. Even though it technically isn't part of our house, it defines the outer edge of what we will consider our content. So how exactly do we use the margin when it comes to web? Well, let's go ahead and actually set the body back to its original margin. Here in the code, you can see, let me zoom in just a little bit though, and here in our body, or where we're calling the entire body of our web page, we have this rule I had set for a margin set to 0. Now, go ahead and guess on what will happen if we remove this, but with a single backspace, we'll go ahead and let our page reload, and suddenly we have this little invisible area between the red block and the corner of the page. Why is that? Well, our body initially has a margin, or this invisible outer force field, pushing its size away, and because it can't grow, it shrinks. So with this little white area in between the red block and the corner of our page is simply our web page squeezing down because it has been told specifically to set an outside area where it has some breathing space. So let's go ahead and move into the tips and tricks. Well, actually, let's go ahead and look at some examples of using margins before we move on to the tips and tricks. So in the case of our body, let's go ahead and set it back to 0, just so that we have a blank slate to work with. Now, let's go ahead and look at how we can use margin and exactly how to best use it. So to condense the tips and tricks and the use, just because there isn't really much you can do with that, we'll go ahead and start with our general rule of margin. With a margin, you have to think of a box in your mind, or you can look at the box on your screen. And there's a certain order we'll have to keep in mind in just a second, but let's just set an initial height. Now, with margin, you can set a property value of a single value, and it will create that space around the entire box. So to begin, I'll go ahead and place in 50 px, and our block moved this much. Why is that? Well, it has a margin of 50 px or pixels from the top, right, bottom, and left. Now, this is actually something we can control individually. And I'll go ahead and show you three examples of how to do that. So, for our margin, we'll go ahead and choose 50 px and 20px. What does this do? Well, once it refreshes, like so, we will see that we have 50 pixels of space on the top and 20 pixels of space on the right and the left. You can't visually see it, but we also have the same happening for the bottom. And with this, what we've essentially done is created a rule where for the top and bottom margins, we'll have 50 pixels, and left and right will have 20. Now, let's go ahead and talk about that order I had brought up before. This time, I'm going to set up 50 pixels, 40 pixels, let's do 20. Let's do 80 pixels, or just because I know this will land somewhere odd, let's do 80 pixels, and then another 40 pixels. Like this, we'll end up with something like this, where it's almost the same on this side and this side, but what we have is the margin working in order. And the same will actually apply for border and padding. So keep this order in mind. We first control the top we can control all of them with a single number, which will set them all equal to the same. We can set 2 at the time, left and right, top and bottom, with 2 different values, and then we can control all 4 in the order of top, right, bottom, and left. So to end off with margin, I'll go ahead and explain an easier way to not have to use shorthand and control the top, bottom, left, and right individually. So I'll go ahead and set this margin to margin left. And like that, our margin, we only have a margin on the left of our block, and we have no margin on the top. So in order to control that, just following the same convention as margin dash left, we have margin dash top, and here I'll be able to control or add 30px, and like that, we have control of our margins. What is the main takeaway here? If we ever have content that we think is just a little too close to something else, we can take control of this margin rule and push or nudge in the exact direction we want. Now, to move forward with our experiment, I'm actually going to go ahead and set a single margin for this entire block now. And again, I'll set it to 50 pixels. Now, we'll transition into our second topic of padding. Now, what is padding? You can kind of think of padding in the same way that you could think of padding when it comes to sports. When you play football, you wear padding. This makes you just a little bit larger because it pushes your clothes outwards. The padding is on the inside, unlike the margin, which pushes things from the outside. So you could really think of your margin being your arm space, whereas your padding would be underneath. So with padding, let's go ahead and look at it in action. So I'll add some padding to my element, and let's say I pad it just so we can make it visible, another 50 pixels. And like that, our block is suddenly a lot larger. The reason is that the actual content, or the actual block, is here in the center, and maybe we can see this if I add some text in here. And like that, you can see where our the corner of our box actually is. Now we have all of this fluff or padding on the inside of the block. And just like the margin, we can control the left, the top, and the bottom, all with one single CSS property if we wanted to control things individually. But just like padding, we can control all of them at once, or just the bottom and the top with these. Now, what if we just want to control only the top and left, but we want to use one value of padding? Simply add 2 zeros, and like that, we have the top and the right, while the other values are equal to 0. Let's move on to the border. So finally, for border, we're going to be following primarily the same rules, but we're going to have a couple of exceptions because we can modify things in a way that's different from padding and margins. So let's go ahead and actually eliminate the padding that we had. Actually, let's go ahead and keep it. And now I'll add a border of, let's say, now with border, what we actually initially have to do is define what type of border. So in this case, and in most cases, honestly, you'll want a solid line, but no, you do have the option for dotted as well. So I'll go back to solid, and now I'll set the thickness, which is a quality that is inherent to the margin and the padding. But let's go ahead and set, just to play around, to 20. Now, this works in the same way, somewhere in between a margin and a padding, but the border works as a literal border, and we'll make sure that nothing from the well, actually, we can have the border climb inwards and encroach on our padding, or we can have it push outwards and push our margin out even further. Because instead of subtracting, it can actually add to the width or height of your HTML block. But with this 20 pixels, we'll move forward and add a different color. And this will make up the syntax for a border. It goes in the order of the border type, how thick the border is, and finally, the color. So with that, we have our border, and just like with the margin and padding, we can do border top, border bottom, and so on. So with these three tools, we can actually go ahead and really become masters of the web. Now we can push things any which way, any which direction, and with this, we'll be able to control the size and how much area that our HTML elements take up with a lot more precision. The main takeaways of these three tools will just be take two. So with take three. So with the three new, take four. So with these three new tools, we'll be able to take five. So with these three new tools, we'll be able to add a lot more precision to the management and use of our HTML blocks. We'll be able to push things from the left to the right and define the areas of our blocks, again, with more precision. Our key takeaways here will be the management of our blocks, as well as understanding that each of these blocks can be controlled to a high level of degree with simply a couple of rules. Now, I hope you'll join us next week, where we'll touch on colors in the web and learning how to master and control those. Hope you'll join.